Perhaps no aspect of Chinese culture has been so misunderstood as the dragon. In Western mythology, the hero fights the monstrous dragon to save the princess and become king. In China, the dragon marries the princess and becomes father to the hero king. Dragons are not dangers which must be defeated, they are magical spiritual beings which bring good fortune. This misunderstanding has been exploited in Western coverage of China in Africa, presenting China as a ferocious monster. In many African cultures, dragon-like spirits have been symbols of creation and blessing, but the dangerous Western dragon dominates the African perspective on China. Western coverage of China in Africa is often misleading.
Between Africa and China, narratives describing a relationship of neo-colonialism.
They are now all over Africa, buying things.
But African discourse can be equally confused.
It's kind of a challenge. It's kind of a hard competing with Chinese.
Africa to basically be part of the puzzle, jigsaw puzzle, where we all win.
The 2022 Kenya election has been Africa's most China-centric election to date. Both candidates promised to deal with corruption and finance problems with Chinese projects. Odinga said Europe had an older relationship with Kenya than China. China was just a recent funder. Ruto went further, promising to deport Chinese nationals who roast maize and steal Kenyan jobs. But the words of politicians looking to win votes are deceptive. Chinese porcelain as old as 900 AD has been found at archaeological sites in Kenya, predating the arrival of European sailors. A small group of Kenyans on Lamu Island boast Chinese ancestry, being the descendants of sailors shipwrecked in the early 1400s. Long before maize arrived in Africa, there were Chinese living in Kenya. The confusion over China in Africa can partly be explained by how changeable the relationship has been. China has appeared in Africa as a global empire and as a fellow victim of European colonialism. It has seemed both weak and strong, both kindred spirit and rival competitor. In this respect, the Chinese dragon is a good metaphor for China in Africa. The curves of its body signify the changing nature of life. This is the story of China in Africa, the Dragon's Tale. The fertile lands around the Yellow and Yangtze River have been the historic heartland of ancient China. Like the Nile in Egypt, annual flooding allowed ancient farmers to harvest bumper crops and sustain larger populations. But unlike Egypt, China was perched on the edge of the Eurasian landmass, with jungles to the south, deserts to the west and north, and the Pacific east. This geographic isolation reinforced a sense of shared identity. Chinese history has been very diverse, comprising different ethnic groups and dynasties, but viewing China's history as a single continuous thread, going back 5,000 years, remains popular today. By 600 AD, China had developed a distinctive culture of power and organization. Society was organized in a hierarchy, with nobility and peasant farmers. Scholar bureaucrats administered the empire. The emperor's power was justified by the mandate of heaven. Many emperors claimed to be the descendants of dragons. Philosophical schools competed for power, each with its own idea of how things should be organized. In this period, China was ruled by the Tang Dynasty, whose capital, Shenyang, had 1 million inhabitants, making it the largest urban settlement in the world. China could field enormous armies and accomplish ambitious building projects. The state dominated neighboring territories who paid tribute or became protectorates. Only in the Eurasian steppes and Central Asia did Tang China find comparable military powers. The results of one of these wars left a Tang commander, Du Huan, in captivity. The Abbasid Caliphate used Huan as a prestigious servant, sending him to Ethiopia on a mission to escort a royal prince. Huan eventually returned to China and wrote a history of his travels in the 760s, the first written record of a Chinese person in Africa. Today, China is known globally for its plastic manufacturing. 1,000 years ago, it was an exporter of an equivalent product, porcelain. Unlike pottery, porcelain was hard, light, and did not leak. Unique clays and minerals were required to make it, as well as high heat. China's export of porcelain and silk made it a desirable destination for Arab traders in the Indian Ocean. Exotic raw materials like ivory and ambergris flowed from the African coast to Chinese port cities. The poet Tuang Cheng-shi, writing in the 800s, knew about the Somali trading port of Berbera. He even described how the Oromo-nomadic pastoralists drank fresh blood from their cattle. In the Chinese imagination, this would have connected them to the Mongol barbarians to the north, who drank the blood of their horses. Africa's place in the Chinese imagination as a land of barbarians and exotic products was reinforced during the Qing Dynasty. The southern Qing lost control of the land route to Asia, leading to an explosion in maritime trade. Chinese products flowed into the Ajuran Empire in Somalia, Kilwa in Tanzania, and even reached as far inland as Great Zimbabwe. The Chinese heard about Africa second-hand through Arab merchants who lived in the Muslim quarters of cities like Guangzhou. But many Chinese scholars frowned on the foreign trade, seeing its profits and luxuries as a pollutant to the nation's harmony. Because of this, few written records exist about Chinese knowledge of Africa. This lack of knowledge allowed ambitious travelers to exploit Qing ignorance. In 1071, a group of merchants arrived in China claiming to be ambassadors from Zheng, the land of black people. Their leader, Zheng was given gifts and a royal title in recognition of his voyage. He claimed to come from a land beyond Oman, where men rode elephants and horses and made glass, coins, and followed a written code of laws. Today, Zheng is considered to have been a traveling merchant who exploited his host's ignorance with tall stories. One Chinese man who could boast some knowledge of Africa was a port official, Chao Jukua, who worked closely with Arab traders in the 1200s. He knew second-hand about zebras, giraffes, and ostriches, but ultimately his interest in Africa lay in her ports and resources, the gold, rhino horns, tortoise shells, and scented woods. The flow of goods was accompanied by a flow of people. China's connection to Arab traders linked it into the Indian Ocean slave trade. Chinese documents narrate how African children were tricked by slavers promising them food. One Qing source describes the presence of African slaves in Guangzhou. In Guangzhou, most of the wealthy people keep devil slaves. They are very strong and can lift heavy weights. Their language and tastes are unintelligible. Their nature is simple and they do not run away. They are also called wild men. Their color is black as ink, their lips are red and their teeth white. They are male and female. Despite these connections, it would be another 300 years before the first recorded state expedition to Africa. In the early 1400s, the Ming Dynasty was new and looking to prove itself worthy to rule China. The Yongle Emperor, who had recently seized power, funded the creation of a fleet of trading vessels, warships, and enormous treasure ships. Some were over 70 meters wide. Over 27,000 sailors were spread over several hundred ships. Over the next 30 years, the Ming fleet conducted 7 expeditions, conquering hostile navies, trading in distant lands, and forging diplomatic connections, all the way to Africa. The Chinese fleet divided in two during the 4th expedition, with a secondary fleet reaching East Africa. The entire imperial fleet, under the command of Muslim court eunuch Zheng, arrived in Mogadishu in 1418, where they delivered greetings from the emperor, took local diplomats on board, and traded silk and porcelain for exotic goods. They stopped at Brava, Zubu, and Malindi before beginning the long journey back to China. Back home, Zheng He displayed the gifts and tributes sent by the rulers he had visited. Lions, leopards, camels, ostriches, zebras, rhinoceroses, and antelopes became part of the imperial zoo, adding to the emperor's prestige. But it was the giraffe which caused the greatest stir. Somalis referred to it as a girin, which sounded very similar to a mythical Chinese beast, the qilin. The qilin was supposed to appear only when perfect virtue and harmony had been achieved in the empire. Court poets wrote poems praising the giraffe and its message of imperial flourishing. In 1421, Zheng He returned to the African coast with his fleet, returning the African diplomats who had accompanied him to China 3 years earlier. More gifts were exchanged, trading conducted, and further diplomats elected to render homage to the emperor. Despite the death of the Yongle emperor in 1430, Zheng He returned to Africa a third time again, taking more emissaries. The frequent voyages were creating and reinforcing Chinese influence on the Indian Ocean trade. No other state could rival China's maritime power. Some temporarily became tributaries or protectorates of China. But in 1433, everything changed. The enormous fleet had been controlled by a faction of eunuchs at the imperial court. Their rivals, Confucian scholar bureaucrats, put increasing pressure on the new emperor to end the expeditions. Profits from the voyages were controlled by the eunuch faction, making them a threat to the imperial administration. Eventually, the eunuchs lost out, and the fleet was gradually disbanded. Records of the voyages were destroyed by the state. The trading patterns established by Zheng He remained long afterwards. In East Africa, Chinese visits to Malindi saw it flourish at the expense of neighbouring Kilwa. On Lamu Island, shipwrecked Chinese sailors married into the local community, building traditional Chinese tombs out of coral and preserving small signs of their culture. The Ming voyages were always about expanding the prestige and influence of the state. Ming maps show a tiny Africa next to an enormous China. But for some bureaucrats, even a small Africa was too much to bear. China had been on the cusp of becoming a global maritime power. Now, the dismantling of the fleet and a ban on private maritime trade was accompanied by an inward turn. Instead of building ships, the state began building a wall. Initially, the inward turn seemed to benefit China. By 1800, Qing Dynasty China ruled more than 1/3 of the world's population and boasted its largest economy. Apart from giraffes, China seemed to have everything one could need. But without realizing, China had ceded control of trading networks to European colonial powers. Suddenly, European global hegemony was on China's doorstep. In the 1660s, Chinese communities in Southeast Asia were the first to suffer the consequences. As the Dutch East India Company established control over Jakarta, Indonesia, and the Cape in South Africa, the colonial bureaucrats thought they saw an opportunity for profit. Lands in the Cape could be developed by hard-working agriculturalists. Impressed by the farmers in Southeast Asia, the Dutch began encouraging Chinese in Jakarta to make the long voyage to settle in South Africa. But no one wanted to go. In 1660, the first Chinese convicts arrived in South Africa. Over the next century, a population of roughly 100 Chinese prisoners would live in the colony. Those who served their sentence could remain in South Africa, being given the status afforded to free black Africans. By the 1740s, these free Chinese ran small shops and restaurants in the Cape. According to one chronicler, they lived a humble, quiet, and orderly life. This Chinese presence in Africa would increase under the British Empire. China had historically relied on sophisticated canal building to transport things across its empire. Without this benefit, Europeans had developed steam and rail power. As the British Empire put pressure on China to open itself up to free trade, they were able to deploy steamships against China's wooden junks. After victory in the First Opium War, Britain gained control over Hong Kong and forced China to allow free trade of the drug opium, which made addicts in China and enriched British companies. It wasn't long before British pressure forced the Qing Emperor to allow the emigration of Chinese people. something which had hitherto been officially forbidden. Britain began to export industrious Chinese labourers who were considered to have a better work ethic than local people in many parts of the empire. In 1870 South Africa, Chinese labourers were used to build roads, harbours, and state buildings. Economic instability caused by European imperialism created an impetus to emigrate amongst many people living in the Chinese province of Guangdong. Two ethnic groups, the Hakka and Cantonese, became notable for their emigration to South Africa. Many Hakka settling in coastal cities, whilst the Cantonese settled further inland. Chinese immigrants were often subjected to racism. When 18 Chinese men arrived by boat in 1881, a local white newspaper published a diatribe. 250 John Chinamen landed, with a cargo of fireworks, chopsticks, and peacock feathers. The lower class of Chinese are filthy, terrible, dirty thieves. But this racism didn't stop colonial administrators and businessmen seeing cheap Chinese labour as a source of fast profits. In the Gold Coast, colonial administrators struggled to find Africans willing to work long hours in colonial mines and plantations. The British looked to import Chinese labourers to solve these problems. One colonial official believed the Chinese presence would force Africans to learn and work harder under the spur of competition. In practice, the foreign labourers struggled with disease and climate, eventually returning home. Local Africans used the failure of Chinese labour to support their argument that the colonial labour problem was created by unjust working conditions, not racial inferiority. More success was had in southern Africa. In the 1890s, Chinese labourers helped build railways from Beira to Umtali and Lawrence Marquez to Komatiport. In Portuguese Mozambique, several hundred Chinese artisans lived in the port cities of Lourenço Marques and Beira. In 1903, the community built a small pagoda as a celebration of their culture. Immigrants leaving China were fleeing a period of chaos and foreign invasions, but the first half of the next century would be equally chaotic. A rebellion in the army brought Imperial China to an end in 1912. Although the new Chinese Republic initially seemed to create some stability, it wasn't long before a period of warlordism returned. The problems of foreign interference and a weak central state remained, but it was in this period that a new connection with Africa was forged. Chinese Muslims had been visiting Egypt since the 1850s to learn Arabic and study the Quran. Following the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, a group of Hui students was sent by the Chinese government to Al-Azhar University in Cairo, in part to build positive relations with Arab nations. Of these scholars, the most famous was perhaps Muhammad Marjian, who produced the most widely used translation of the Quran in China. He also translated Confucian texts into Arabic. Other graduates moved into the diplomatic sphere. Wang Ximing was deployed to the Chinese embassy in Jeddah. Whilst the Egypt connection grew, the situation in China continued to degenerate. By 1937, the Japanese invasion forced the Chinese nationalist and communist groups into alliance. With American and Soviet funding, China's armed resistance eventually overcame the Japanese invaders, immediately triggering a civil war between nationalist and communist parties. Chinese communities in South Africa raised funds for the nationalists during the 1940s. South Africa was one of the few African states the Republic of China had an established diplomatic link with. The outcome of the Civil War would have a lasting impact on China's relationship with Africa. In 1949, the nationalist forces had retreated to Taiwan, whilst the communists held the mainland. In this new reality, many Chinese had to choose a side. The Hui scholars in Egypt were split. Ma Jiang sided with Mao's forces, returning to teach at a university in the mainland, whilst Ximing travelled to Taiwan to serve as an imam. Communist China was looking to legitimize itself, and Africa was seen as a source of potential friends. Mao believed Africa was an intermediate zone, where China could assert its role as a world power on par with Europe, America, and the USSR. Communist China established its ascendancy in Egypt during the Suez Crisis, offering NASA financial support in his war with Britain, France, and Israel. In doing so, they mirrored a policy adopted by the Soviet Union. In theory, Soviet and Chinese interests in Africa should have aligned, but Mao and Khrushchev adopted increasingly different interpretations of communist theory. This Sino-Soviet split created confusion in Africa. In Angola, the FNLA was receiving Chinese funding from the early 1960s. Jonas Savimbi was invited to China to meet Mao Zedong. Meanwhile, the Soviets funded the MPLA. The Chinese were happy to dive into the chaotic world of supplying funds to fracturing liberation movements, but they also recognized the importance of formal relations with more stable states. In 1963, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai began a visit of 10 African countries: Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Ghana, Mali, Guinea, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia, growing China's influence in the region. Enlai famously decided to go ahead with a visit to Nkrumah in Ghana, despite a recent coup attempt, a choice which won him Nkrumah's respect. Enlai returned from his visit, reflecting that Africa was ripe for revolution. Funding and aid to Africa immediately increased. China's open stance to Africa eventually led it to finance its first serious infrastructure project on the continent. Many aspects of this project mirror the dynamics surrounding contemporary Chinese projects in Africa. Western nations were derogatory, calling it a bamboo railway. The British Prime Minister Harold Wilson said corrupt African leaders were being paid by China to accept it. Mao presented the project as a gift given at China's own expense. On a visit to China, he told Tanzanian President Nyerere, "You have difficulties, as do we, but our difficulties are different. To help you build the railway, we are willing to forsake building railways for ourselves." This fraternal sentiment was accompanied by a $500 million loan, which was to be fully paid back by 2013. 50,000 Chinese workers were brought in to build the line. In Tanzania, China was another poor developing nation, struggling to industrialize. In Ethiopia, China presented itself quite differently, drawing on the shared imperial heritage enjoyed by both nations. The many twists and turns in the dragon's tail allowed China to find some shared connections with most African states. This careful and expensive diplomacy paid off in 1971, when China was voted to take a seat at the United Nations. Many African nations had voted for China to Mao's delight. It was our fellow developing countries that carried the People's Republic of China into the United Nations. Communist China took a seat previously occupied by Taiwan. The Taiwanese state still maintained that it was the legitimate Chinese government, in exile after nationalist defeat in the Civil War. Although the 1971 UN vote was a victory for Communist China, the diplomatic battle between the two Chinas continued in Africa long afterwards. Taiwan was actively building its own network in Africa, offering an alternative to the communist-coloured funding of Mao's China. To nationalists like Kamuzu Banda in Malawi, Taiwan's small size and well-managed industrialization was an inspiration. On a visit to Taiwan in 1967, he stated, "When I left home, I told the people I was coming here to learn and to be inspired. I repeated it when I arrived here, and I meant every word of it." After Mao's death in 1976, Deng Xiaoping turned Communist China's focus inwards to internal reforms. This relaxation of Mao's policy and persecution was known as the Boluan Fanzeng. Xiaoping gradually moved China away from a planned economy to open the nation up to foreign investment. The transition from communism to Chinese state capitalism would transform Chinese activities in Africa. Communist China's African policy in the 1980s was characterized by rivalry with Taiwan and the Soviet Union. China decided to fund Robert Mugabe's ZANU armed resistance after they were spurned by the Soviets. But it was under Jiang Zemin in the early 1990s that Chinese funding began to flow into Africa on a scale comparable to the days of Mao. Zemin was again looking for international friends after Tiananmen Square. But the economic package offered by 1990s China was quite different to that offered under Mao. " 」 . 」 . 。 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 . 」 In 1999, growing Chinese investment in Africa was given the state stamp of approval and labelled as the going out policy. Loans from Chinese state-owned banks, like Exim, were offered to African governments. Much more money flowed directly into the accounts of Chinese state-owned enterprises in Africa. The degree to which these SOEs are affiliated with the Chinese government has caused some confusion amongst Western commentators. Connections between powerful SOEs and the Chinese Communist Party are often personal, influential marriages, or relatives. China's status as a global manufacturing hub coloured its trading interests in Africa. Raw resources were sought after. Cheap, mass-produced plastics entered the African marketplace, bankrupting local artisans and some African factories. This explosion of economic activity was justified by the Communist Party in Maoist terms. China in Africa was focused on non-interference, mutual cooperation, and solidarity created by shared suffering at the hands of European colonizers. For many African nations, the trade promised by China outweighed Taiwan's offer of aid and infrastructure. One of the last countries to end relations with Taiwan was Malawi in 2008. Taiwanese-funded factories now lie rusting, whilst a Chinese road displays a newly painted sign. Today, only Eswatini recognizes the existence of Taiwan. Malawi's diplomatic shift continues to be debated in the country today. Although trade increased, the imagined benefits of a relationship with China were much greater than what materialized. China is interested in raw resources, and Malawi's agriculture-dominant economy had little to woo the Chinese investor. Rather, it was countries like Angola who experienced serious Chinese investment in the 2000s. In resources for infrastructure deals, hundreds of Chinese companies built hospitals, road networks, and factories. In exchange, China secured most of Angola's oil at reduced prices. Although Chinese investment boosted local infrastructure, it also locked the country into semi-dependency on China. Recent Angolan politicians have tried to diversify the nation's trade and diplomacy to lessen this dependency. Today, Angola owes Chinese lenders roughly $17 billion. The fear of a Chinese debt trap made headlines in the West in the 2010s, but closer analysis revealed things to be more complex. A good example of confusion and negative publicity has been China's new standard gauge railway in Kenya. In 2013, China announced a new phase of the going out policy. The Belt and Road Initiative would focus on infrastructure provision, making it easier for China's partners to transport goods. In Kenya, this plan crystallized in the form of a new railway. The original contract was never made public. After a court ruled this was illegal, a few more sections were released, but the entire document is still unavailable. Misreading one section of the agreement, commentators believed the deal allowed China to seize control of the port in Mombasa if debt repayments were late. In fact, it simply stated income from taxation would have to be used to pay back loans if the railway did not produce sufficient profit. Resentment over foreign debt has marred China's relationship with Zambia, which exports most of its raw copper to the Asian giant. The willingness of Chinese investors to overlook and even engage in corruption has given the country a bad name. Poor decisions by Zambian politicians have left the country heavily in debt to China. The large-scale immigration of Chinese businessmen and workers has aggravated the situation. Violence against Zambia's 20,000 Chinese nationals is a common occurrence and became especially notable during the coronavirus outbreak in 2020. Day-to-day interactions between Africans and Chinese in the workplace are often hampered by cultural differences. In China, it is not uncommon for videos of bosses humiliating or beating their staff to make headlines, but when Chinese mine owners hit or punish African staff, for many it recalls the worst days of European colonialism. Mixed messaging can often damage diplomatic relations. The 2021 state media New Year's show caused controversy when a comedy sketch celebrating China-African ties included actors wearing blackface. Whilst this behaviour is considered inappropriate in the West, it also offended many Africans. when, a year later, a Chinese national in Malawi was arrested for selling videos of children saying racist phrases in Chinese, China's embassy was quick to condemn the behavior. The Chinese government has zero tolerance for racism. The rough and tumble of China's re-engagement with Africa has led to mixed publicity in Africa. It's perhaps a little surprise that China has chosen to invest heavily in African media organizations. This has offered many up-and-coming African journalists employment, especially at a time when Western media coverage of Africa is shrinking. But it has also constrained media coverage critical of China. When a Kenyan news platform ran a story about corruption in the Chinese-funded rail project, their Chinese funding was withdrawn, triggering a financial crisis in the organization. Beyond the media, Chinese companies have offered African nations something they describe as digital sovereignty. Many people don't realize how physical the internet is. Undersea cables and massive servers transmit and store data. Many of these are based in Asia, America, and Europe. In the 2020s, Huawei has been offering African governments their own internet data centers, providing a more secure way to protect government data. Meanwhile, in rural villages across Africa, painted walls advertise that TV or internet access has been provided by Chinese-funded projects. China has become a crucial actor in the flow of information on the continent. For African leaders, the prospect of China as an alternative to Western funding has been empowering. However, when leaders fail to diversify and only think about short-term interests, then countries can quickly become heavily dependent on China, disempowering them on the world stage. China's image in Africa is fluid, twisting and turning like the curves in the dragon's tail. For hundreds of years, Chinese trade has been an important part of the economic life of African states. Once an imperial power, Chinese people entered Africa in the 19th century as pawns in European colonial projects. Mao drew heavily on this sense of shared suffering. Whilst the discourse of developing country solidarity had some purchase in the 1960s, it now seems out of place. China is a global superpower and should be treated as such by African leaders. China has transformed African nations through infrastructure projects. It has supported liberation movements and continues to welcome African nationals to study at its universities. But as China's economic growth slows, funding for African projects has begun to decline. China has tentatively entered the realm of security in Africa, establishing its first military base in Djibouti. Just round the corner may be the next twist in the dragon's tail. If you enjoyed this content and would like more, please subscribe to the Africa Review on YouTube.